Thank you, Bonnie. I believe every one of those words was pronounced correctly. We appreciate you doing that for us this morning. I was struck as I heard Paul pray this morning, the sense of gut punch that we have felt, many have felt for a variety of reasons, COVID just being one of them, although a complication for other pieces of it as well too, and realize, so here we are together as God's people in this place, and what does the future look like? Tabitha Elward, during our service on the 26th, uses a word to describe what the next year might look like, and she was saying that she wasn't quite sure what words she was going to pick yet. And we discovered as a family that on the internet you can actually go to a website and it will randomly pick a word for you. Thank you very much. Some of those words actually in our family was be. The other one was finish. That seemed a little ominous to us. My word was active, and I thought, well, that's okay, but I had actually already picked a word, and it was clay, based on a conversation we had on the in the courtyard on the 26th, to just be live life plainly and close to the ground, and also be willing to be formed and shaped as well. And I hope that's what happens for us as a church too. That God shapes us and forms us and keeps us malleable so that he can do that work among us. And that's really where we're going to head during these next couple of weeks. I'm still learning about what the seasons are like here. What is it like? How many of us are remote this morning, online, or gone other places? Do we really gather on January 2nd together? The question will loom larger next year. It's January 1st, right? But fortunately, we have technology that can help with that. And I must tell you, I am so excited to move into this next year together with you and as a congregation that I want to get started. And so we'll start together this morning by going back to Ezra 8, but also looking forward to say, God, what do you have for us as a church? What does it look like? And there are a number of elements of that. But I want to start this morning with, what does it look like for us to have a posture of openness to what God might be? What are the dynamics of that? So would you pray with me as we begin this time, and not just for the next 20 or 30 minutes together, but for who we become as a congregation and our openness to what that might be. Would you please join me in prayer? Dear God, thank you so much for the years and years of work you have done in our lives as individuals, as families, and as a congregation. We're thankful for that, for the foundation that provides for us to even ask this question this morning and in the next couple of weeks and month or two. What does it mean for us to live into the future you have for us? And so, Lord, I pray that you would allow our hearts to be tender as we ask this question, and open to you as we discern what you might say. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. One of the congregations I served a number of years ago in the Kansas City area, one of the most faithful young dads in our congregation, a great commitment to his wife and to his kid, just celebrating their walk with the Lord, working with a number of young men and connecting with them and just trying to, in any way, pass on to them lessons that he learned from his own walk with the Lord and from others as well. In a hard charging business too, just a hard charger, but so that was so true of his faith as well. And one Sunday morning he came up to me and he said, Mark, you just wouldn't believe what happened. I was in the coffee shop just a couple days ago, and this guy comes in with a camera, and he asks, I'm reading my Bible, and he asks if he can just take a picture of my Bible. And it looked something like this. Can we get that? I just picked this off the internet, but it's a picture of his Bible. His Bible was this well-worn, tattered book. And he said this photographer asked me if he could take a picture of it. He said he was collecting pictures of sacred objects. And Chuck looked at me and says, that's kind of cool, wasn't it? And I said, well, I suppose it was kind of cool, but if he actually was collecting pictures of sacred objects, what a miss. He should have taken a picture of you. and no doubt others in the coffee shop. You see, isn't it interesting that when we think about what is sacred, we are inclined to imagine it to be objects rather than people. Would you identify yourself as sacred? Would you? If not, that is your most profound misunderstanding of who you are, or your most significant missed opportunity. To be a sacred person. That's what I want us to talk about this morning. We see that clearly in Ezra chapter 8. And we're going to talk about this theme of what does it mean to live a life of courageous consecration. Now, before we dig deep into it, I just want to share a little bit about where all of this is leading. There are really 4 identifiers that are true of at least a congregation in regards to their life together. The one is this: well, what are our core values? What marks us? What do we stand for? And not just even aspirationally, but we actually live into this. And we've actually talked about this. We talked about this in September and in October. We talked about these core values, and we noted several of them, 5 of them really. One is, what does it mean for us to embody radical hospitality for every person that God has made because of their human dignity, and for us to be as radically hospitable as Jesus was, to be interculturally curious because the global church is wide and broad and experienced and worth learning from. What does it mean for us to be characterized by convictions that are carried humbly as we grow and learn and serve others and God? And what does it mean, even when we know that our convictions are different from one another, for us to live with one another in gracious relationships with each other? And then finally, to be characterized in all of this by whole life worship, not just simply what we do on Sunday mornings or in certain places, but what does it mean for us to live a life of whole life worship? So we've identified those as values. These should mark the people of Jesus, the followers of Christ, those who call themselves Christians. But there's another element of it, and that is, where are we headed? Someone has said, if you aim at nothing, you're sure to hit it. What is the church intended to aim for? I mean, why do we exist? Why do we function? What is our goal? And I want us to unpack that with real clarity, beginning next week and for 4 weeks, talk about the character of what's the goal of the church. And I must tell you that I have a great certainty in regards to what the core values are of Jesus' people and what the goal of the church is meant to be. But there's this other element of it that I don't know, and we need to learn together. And that is, what is our unique contribution to the capital C church? As a community in this place, right here in this place, in your neighborhoods, in our city, in this place. What is the unique contribution when God imagines a future for us and invites us into it? What will it look like? Not just simply a bunch of disparate endeavors, but an endeavor or two that we embrace as a congregation. And I want us to talk about this. We've had a couple of conversations as a council about what that might look like, but this is what we do together as a family. And we're going to talk about that, particularly on February 6th, as we continue to process this together, to lay something out that says, could this possibly be what the next season of ministry is for us as a congregation, our unique contribution to what it means to be the body of Christ in this place? But there's another piece of that. Besides what our values are and what the goal is, what God's goal is for the church and what the unique contribution of our church is, it's what will our posture be towards it? What does it mean to actually lean in? To actually lean in as a church in this place. What does it look like for us to be that way? And that's what I want to talk about this morning. Before we get on to some of the other elements, I want to talk about this basic thing. What does it mean for us to lean into the calling that God has given us and the unique contribution that is a part of it? Now, some of you have been around here for a long time. Others come back after a season of being gone from COVID, and others are saying, hey, we think we want to be part of this place. And so, as Kristen mentioned earlier, we're going to do a class. It's kind of a new members class, but it's sort of an orientation to who are we as a church, not only in this place, but broadly as the denomination that we are. And even to say, well, what are we like? And I want to learn more about what God is doing in this place. And so there's those opportunities that are coming up, and we'd invite you to be part of them. But we're going to have broad discussions here over the next number of weeks. So Ezra 8 this morning offers us a clear example of the posture of people that decided to live out their faith in God to completely. Ezra 8 cannot be read, Bonnie read it for us, cannot be read without noticing the courage that was necessary in this. And this sense of what it means to be consecrated. The word is right there in the text. And so I'm going to look this morning at this theme of courageous consecration. What does it entail? Before we get there, I want us to note what the word means, actually. Merriam-Webster actually helps us with that. And we can see the definition of consecrate is this. The first point of it actually is this: to induct a person into a permanent office with a religious rite. And can we move forward a little bit more? A little bit more? Right there. There we go. Religious rite, especially to ordain someone to the office of bishop. Now, that's a little bit of a problem here, because I don't think we have any bishops in this room, do we? So we're saying, well, consecration, I'm not sure that necessarily fits for us. But fortunately, there's another definition. And the second definition actually recognizes that if humans are made in the image of God, then this topic of consecration is not reduced to typical sacred places. The second aspect of it is to make or declare sacred, especially to devote irrevocably to the worship of God by a solemn ceremony. And the reference point is to consecrate a church, and we would say that it's broader than that. That's what Ezra 8 says, actually. It is to consecrate a group of people, to be devoted irrevocably to the worship of God in some solemn ceremony. Now, we do this in what are typically sacred spaces. When children are born, we would maybe perhaps dedicate them or baptize them with this recognition and this prayer that they belong to God, and we trust that as they grow, they will discover the goodness of God and take it on for their faith as well. Another way that we do that is through confirmation, and it's been a joy to be a part of working with the 7th and 8th graders as they're really figuring out, is this faith actually belong to me or not? I know parents think it's important. I know the church thinks it's important, but will I live by it? And to study the life of Jesus and the character of God and the beauty of the gospel and decide, yes, that's what I want for my life. And you know what? The choice to go through confirmation is a choice to walk into consecration. This is also true for us as adults. We urge people to surrender their life to God and to His purposes. That's what it means to be consecrated. Now, here's the piece of it. It's not just simply what we do when we're active in this room and active together in this community. It's what we do 24/7, 365 to actually live out a consecrated life. What is that like? What is it characterized by? Well, today we want to understand the nature of this consecration. Let's look at the story first. Really an interesting setup here. The people decide, this is the second group that are going back to Jerusalem. And they've been given permission to do so, and so they assemble together for the trip, and Ezra has a list of people that he's invited to be able to come along. And then there are those that need to come along because they're actually going back to Jerusalem where the temple appears. And so they take the ones who are actually by their vocation or career titled consecration, probably more than any other group, the Levites. And he discovers that they have decided not to join in. So we see here a people that have assembled for the trip. They're actually leaving Babylon behind. And for many of them, they're heading to a place that many had never been before. I mean, this is a journey into the unknown, especially for those who were younger in this travel group together. Jerusalem, we've heard about it. We've also heard it's a pretty rough place. And that's the challenge. There weren't many Levites among them. And Ezra finds this out, and he rejects their first response. He says, thank you, but no thank you. And he says, no, that's not good enough. Ezra challenges the first inclination of the consecrated people, those with the title of consecration. What was their first inclination? Well, we're not really clear on this, but Ezra sends influential family heads and teachers to speak with the Levites and to coax them to come along. We don't know the reason why they said no, but it can be implied from the change of heart that they had, that there was a sense in them that they didn't necessarily, I don't feel necessarily called to go back to Jerusalem. Or you know what, might be good for all those other folks, but it's not necessarily good for me. I mean, Babylon was a comfortable place. And in the decades that followed this, it became increasingly comfortable for the people from the Israelites. It was a beautiful place, ample resources, and they were favored people. And they grew even more favored and wealthy as time went on. That versus a 1,000-mile trip on foot to a place many of them had never been, in convoy, with others and valuables. I mean, about 30 to 40 pounds, if you calculate this correctly, of gold and silver that they were carrying over 1,000 miles with all of the people that were very interested in those resources along the way. And then to engage in, particularly for the Levites, in a task that they had never done before. I mean, they were temple servants. There was no temple in Babylon. I mean, what a job that is, huh? I'm a temple servant. Oh, got nothing to do. I guess I'm going to just play golf. I don't know what it was like exactly, but there is this clear sense here that they weren't actually engaged in the thing that they called to and felt pretty comfortable in being disengaged. Thanks very much for the invitation, the Levites said. Thanks very much, but I think we'll just stay. And before we, as Montecito Covenant Church, determine where we head, we need to be candid about the challenge in heading there. See, we've got to look around the room and find out if there are any Levites here. Right? Any Levites in the room? Those for whom they're not all that excited about going anywhere different. I just have to let you know there's a Levite living in the parsonage. I'm not kidding. Especially around 7 or 8 o'clock at night. Let's take the dogs out for a walk, my wife Beth says. And I'm already pretty settled in. Walk the dogs, are you kidding me? I feel really comfortable sitting on the couch right now. It's quite natural, actually, for me to stay right where I am, to say no to what I don't know. Any others in the room that way? An object at rest tends to stay at rest. For those of you who love physics and Newton's first law, there it is. An object in motion tends to stay in the same direction as that motion. Are any of you here those who prefer the status quo of your life? Can you just raise your hand? And for those that you didn't raise your hand, why are you sitting in the same seat you always sit in? You know what I mean? That's kind of the way things are. So what now does it mean for us to live a life of courageous consecration? Well, I want to identify 4 elements of it. The first one is one we've already talked about. It's holiness. And we talked about this a month or two ago, and we talked about the character of what holiness is like. The word is sacred. And we see it right here in the text. Look at verse 28. It says this, I said to them, you as well as these articles are consecrated to the Lord. It's not just simply the articles, it's you. You are sacred beings. It's what you were intended for. When you were baptized or dedicated as an infant, your parents' deepest longing was that you would be a sacred being. When you made that decision to follow Jesus in the midst of all of the other options and you said, you made a decision to live a life of sacred holiness. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, we know the part of it, and we've talked about this some, so I won't be long on it. But one is to be attentive to what is right and to guard our lives in that regard. But there's this whole other side of it, and it is to be involved in what is good. Holiness is a river that flows through deserts and waters dry places. Holiness is what it means to see injustice and say something about it, to see brokenness and be involved in the repair, to be restorers of walls and streets with names. That's what it means to be holy. It's moral standards, but it's also human flourishing. It's beauty and order and flourishing and worship. So when God's people decided to leave Babylon behind and journey to Jerusalem, it wasn't just to do a construction project and build a temple. It was to create a place out of which would flow goodness and beauty and flourishing. That's the whole definition of what it means to be God's holy people. To be consecrated people means for us to be attentive to the brokenness in the world and the opportunities for the world to flourish again. It is time for us to carefully consider what it means for us uniquely as Montecito Covenant Church to contribute to these purposes of God, to live lives of courageous consecration, to be holy people. That's courageous. That's consecration. There's a second piece of it here, and we see it in regards to humility. It says in verse 21, "There, by the Ahava Canal, I proclaimed a fast, so that we might humble ourselves before our God and ask Him for a safe journey for us and our children with all of our possessions." There's a sense of it. He called them to fast and to pray for safe travels. And, as I look, I think, I grew up in a tradition, Christian tradition, where before we would go on vacation or on big trips, we would just gather around the car and pray for safety on the road. I really like that, actually. I think it's a really cool thing. And I wonder if it actually goes back to this. But the thing that was missing between, the distinction between what we did as a family, as much as I love it, and what they were doing here, is that they prayed for safe travels when they were involved in the mission of God. That's what it was. This was about sacred purposes. How about that? Prayers for safety around our consecrated purposes. And the humility that's a part of this is that, God, if you're not here, it's not going to happen. Humility is not thinking little of ourselves as much as thinking much of God and His vital roles in our lives. And the bigger our purpose gets, the bigger our humility becomes. Because we long for something to happen that we cannot do on our own. It's easy to be humble when our purposes are huge. When they're glorious in terms of what they do to magnify the character of God in the eyes of the people around us. Humility expresses itself then in prayer and fasting. If I can't do it, I am going to be actively involved in conversation with the one who will. I can say, and I feel like I'm a pretty humble person, but I can actually assess the reality of that humility in terms of the activity of my prayer. We actually can do that. I know because of COVID, we've got a prayer room just right over there, and it's not really used very much, and there are reasons for that right now. But I will tell you, once COVID is gone, is my hope that is one of the most active, alive rooms in the building for people on a journey living lives of courageous consecration. And in our lives, just in generally as well too. Biblical humility is a two-sided coin. It's awareness of our own inadequacy, but it's a keen sense of God's sufficiency as well. I want God to put us in places that humble us, that boost our dependence on Him, that extend far beyond, God, would you please make sure you keep us safe as we travel to where we're going physically, but would you be with us as we travel into the future God has for us as well. That's a posture that God calls courageous people to. is a posture of prayer and a posture of passion, holiness. And there's a part of this, and that is to live with hands open to God. You'll notice here that it says that in verse 28, all these things that were consecrated to God, and it's, I'm sorry, in verse 25, and he weighed out to them the offerings of silver and gold and the articles that the king, his advisors had, and officials, and all Israel present there had donated for the house of God. There's a sense of being all in, that it's all his. I said before, 35 to 40 pounds per male traveler, and who knows what the women and the kids were carrying as well, too. But I think it's helpful for us to have clarity about what it means for us to live open-handed lives. Beth and I had just an illustration of this that helped us to be able to see the character. What does it mean to live open-handed lives? We were involved in planting a church. Beth had served on the staff of a really cool church, and part of it was to say, we're going to leave behind Beth's position at this church, and we planted a church in our own neighborhood, with all of the challenges that are part of it, and just trying to figure out what that meant. But by God's grace, the place flourished. And 10 years into it, I said to Beth, I can't ever imagine leaving Meadowbrook. And she said to me, she said, really? Are you that certain? And I thought, I just need to evaluate, what does it mean for me actually to be hands open in my faith, in my walk with the Lord? And I'll tell you, it was literally 4 days after that I picked up a voice message from a friend of mine who invited me to consider the possibility prayerfully that God would be calling us to another church in another place. And my first comment to Terry was, I just have to tell you, I'm just not even interested. And then to hear this nudge from God and do you know what happened for us in that? We had this sense eventually that God was calling us to that place. Part of the difficulty of it was that we were building a house, a brand new house, and our kids walked through. We dreamed dreams and painted the walls, and the day we left for a church in Kansas City was the day we drove to the house that was just completed. The kids walked through their bedrooms. We walked through the house, and we got in the car and we headed for a church in Kansas City. I mean, that to us was, wow, this is like what it means. This is what it means. And that was kind of a wake-up call for us. And I think there are times in our life where we need that sense of, what does it actually mean to live open-handed? And there's a valuable tool for me and perhaps for us. What if you listed the resources that you have controlling interest in, or a share of controlling interest in? Go ahead and just list them. I've listed some. One is some of our it's a property we still own in Wheaton. We have controlling interest in this. And what if this actually doesn't belong to us, but what if it's actually his? You know, here are our automobiles. What if they're ours for now, and then they're just his? They're no longer mine. Here's our investment portfolio and our pension. What if it belongs to Jesus? What does it mean for me to not have controlling interest in this? I had a 1967 Camaro SS convertible. It's a really cool vintage car. Here are my credentials and some of my complications, actually. Yeah, that's true. You see, what do we have that we say to God, I'm going to live open-handed with them? Because, frankly, I have them now, but they're gone sooner than I imagine. What does it mean for us actually to live open-handed, freely offered? And I know this can be a great thing for a church to say, okay, you guys, hand it over. And that's not what the text is about. The text is, what if we actually give it to God? You know, I believe there may come, by God's grace, a point in time where we have this sense that God is calling to a compelling purpose in the next season that is larger than the purpose we have today. And in that moment, we may decide that it's time to give to God more than we ever imagined we would. To God, not to the church, to God's purposes, but God's purpose lived out in this place. When that day comes, will we remember what it means to live by courageous consecration? And then there's one other element of this, and it's the hope, the issue of hope, to this principle of continued courage. It's just so interesting to me in this text that they're told, you know what, we're not going to actually ask for the king's help. And in the past they had. Nehemiah had done this. They said, that's great, and would you accompany us as we take this journey from Babylon to Jerusalem? But in this particular case, they decide not to. It's not that one was right and the other was wrong. It's that there's a principle that transcends the people that accompany you or don't accompany you along the way. And the principle is a principle of courage. It was courageous for Nehemiah to take the trip to Jerusalem accompanied by an escort, and he described it as God's provision. It was courageous for these people to see God's provision not in the escort, but in going it alone with God alone. There's an important observation here to be made, and I think it's this. What was courageous yesterday might not be courageous today. What was a courageous, bold step 10 years ago in my life is no longer a courageous, bold step today in my life. God is far more interested in developing in me, and I believe in all of us, courage more than delivering merchandise. He wants to develop in you courage for the life to come. So here's the question. What will courage look like in your life today? What will courage look like in my life today? And I'm pretty sure it won't be what it looked like in your life 10 years ago. The sense of abiding expectation and hope that God will be with us in a way that is more daunting, more daring than it ever was before. Now, let me share why I think this is so important for us to consider the character of holiness and what it means for us to live hands open, what it means for us to live with humility, and what it means for us to live with a sense of hope and the courage that comes, because I believe God's called us to move forward as a church. And I think the character of this, pardon me, didn't mean to do that. Woke some of you up, right? I believe that God has a hope and a future for us in this next season. And I'm struck by Joshua's words in Joshua chapter 3. Consecrate yourself for tomorrow. The Lord will do things among you that are amazing and remarkable. I'm certain of this. If we choose, God has a significant future in store for us as God's people. But I'm also certain of this, that it will demand from you and me a posture of courageous consecration. So that's why we're celebrating communion this morning. Because it's one of those statements, those physical statements we make where we say, I'm all humble in because God is with us, with me in this. So Kirsten, if you would come now and we will live into this wonderful sacrament that God gives us, a reminder